Rebecca, thanks so much for coming on the podcast this morning. I'm going to ask you the same first question as I always ask. What's the hardest change you've been through in your life?
I had to think quite long and hard about this, Gareth, if I'm honest. And you obviously sent me this question in advance. And I'll start off by saying that I have been exceptionally lucky in my life and very privileged in the sense that both my parents are still alive, my husband's parents are alive. He even has grandparents who are alive, which I'm quite jealous of. And we've not been a family, or I've not been a person that's been hit with like real tragedy in the sense of illness, or things like that, which have happened to closer friends of mine, which sometimes then makes me think things are going so well, what's going to happen? A little bit of pessimism there sometimes. So I'm always taking my health and things like that for complete. I don't take it for granted. It's very, very important, and what a privilege to have not experienced things like that. When I think about difficult things that have happened, it always relates back to career for some reason, even though I try to decenter career all the time. And I think back to a period back in late 2008 when the economy crashed, or as we called it in Ireland, the Celtic Tiger, because it was booming in Ireland, absolutely booming. There was a point where the then Prime Minister, or as we say in Ireland, Taoiseach, said there is a job for everybody who wants it, because Ireland was doing so incredibly well. And all the big tech companies are moving to Dublin and are still there. And the economy crashed like it did globally. And I was 2 months into my student accommodation job, my first student accommodation job in the University of Limerick. And my husband, who was my boyfriend at the time, rang me and said, I've just been made redundant. And I remember I burst out crying. And I had told my boss said the kindest thing. He said, well, isn't it lucky that you've got a really great and secure job? And I was only 2 months in that post, hadn't passed probation. But subsequently what happened was, my husband was unemployed then for the next 9 months. We were very lucky in the sense that we'd free accommodation as part of my job. So we kind of rode through that difficult time. Again, very lucky, unlike so many other people. But it was difficult in the sense that he decided at 27 to go back to university as a full-time student to do a new degree, to completely pivot his career, which is a very brave thing to do. And he went from working in business and marketing to working in pharmaceutical science. And it put our life on hold for about 5 years while he did that. And I was doing my first student accommodation role for 5 years, which I loved and enjoyed. But after maybe about year 3, I was like, okay, I've done this now. I've been through academic years. I'm kind of ready to try something new, but the opportunities weren't there to do that. So I kind of was putting my career on hold for a bit with a long-term vision of the best is yet to come for both of us. And that happened to be true. We kind of went through those 5 years and we moved to the UK, and then he did a master's part-time and working full-time. But there was so much in those 4 years where he was in a room, in the spare room, studying. His mum would complain in very Irish mammy style, I never see you. And I'm like, I never see him, and I live with him, because he's either in the library or in the spare room doing assignments and studying for exams. And he did incredible, but it was difficult because of the time when our friends were all settling down, they were getting married, they were buying houses, they were doing all that kind of stuff. We had little money. We weren't going on extravagant holidays or doing the things that you do at that kind of age. And it was hard, but in hindsight, actually, probably it was all the better for us. But even when I reflect on it, even though it was quite hard, actually, it was the making of us, and it taught me so many things about resilience and patience and kind of like playing the long game. And then when I think about other things that were difficult in my career, I think back to the very, very early stages of my career, my early 20s, my first job out of university, and working in an organisation that no longer exists because it closed down, that treated women very poorly in the workplace and was very misogynistic. And I was too young to know how to kind of stand up for myself. And I think that's why I get really passionate about supporting women at work and equitable experiences and work for all people from all different communities. And I can remember at the time thinking, it's got bad HR, but I didn't really know how to phrase it. But what I really meant was the culture was really, really poor. And they were 2 difficult periods work-related in my life, which I think compared to so many difficult things that lots of other people have been through in their lives, is probably quite trivial when I think about it. So I never take for granted that I have my nearest and dearest around me. They are alive, they are well, as am I, and as is my husband.
I think when you talk about that, putting your life on hold, and well, even going back to, husband being made redundant, the comparison to people around you is quite hard because everybody's on their different time path, right? And I see that with friends that, see friends that have become really successful, and you say, why am I not there yet?
Yeah,
And then people move in and out of that journey, right? And I think that's the hard bit, when it comes to comparing to friends, family, everything else. I've probably got to an age now where I don't really do that anymore. But yeah, I think that's when you talk about bad HR. I came from hospitality. It was it was a different world many years ago, where yeah, I think that lots has changed for the better. We might not be there yet, but lots has changed
definitely.
for the better. But as I always do, going right back, I know you from listening to other episodes of the podcasts you've recorded, that you studied art, and you eventually you got a qualification to teach art, but that's not where you
Indeed.
ended up. But it sounded like that's what you always wanted to do when you were young.
Yeah, I always wanted to study art. I was very naturally creative. There's loads of photographs of me in the 80s. And I know what you're saying, Gareth. I don't look, old enough to be born in the 80s. But yeah, of me sitting on the sofa at home in Ireland, and I'm colouring and I'm drawing. And I had, some people would have posters up in their bedroom of like boy bands. I had Vincent van Gogh and Monet and the Impressionists all over my bedroom. And I absolutely loved that. And art was a huge part of my life. And is now to an extent, but not as it was as a child and a teenager. But I won an art competition when I was 6. I've told this story before. I think it might have been in Mel Louise's podcast, where I won an art competition when I was 6. And I can remember the moment of winning that competition, my name being announced in the classroom. And it was only actually a small local competition, but for me, I might as well have won the Olympics or something at the time. And my my primary school teacher at the time, at the age of 6, had said to my mum, she's very creative. That's what she'd be good at. Pursue that. And that was hard in many senses as well, because it became a huge part of my identity. In primary school, I was the person who was really good at art. People would ask me to draw things for them. And then in Ireland, the school I went to, when you went to kind of the big school, as we call it, like second, third, fourth class, or you're 8, 9, 10, you go into a different part of the school. And so you become mixed with students who were in other classes that you'd not met before. And I can remember the moment I met somebody who was better at art than me. And I can remember what she was drawing. She was drawing a palm tree. I remember looking at it and going, that's actually really good. And I was only about 7 or 8 at the time, already like being really competitive. And we ended up going to the same secondary school and being in the same art classes. And I was always like fighting to be better than her. And it was really hard, actually. I was always putting immense pressure on myself. And I still do that today. And she ended up getting into an art school in Ireland that I didn't get into, and the whole school knew about it. It was really devastating. But I firmly believe I wasn't meant to go there. I think my comeuppance came when we had an award, and it was a big award every year, which is Art Student of the Year. And I won it, and she didn't. And I was like thrilled. That was my like one moment to succeed.
I can already see that with my 4-year-olds. Her and a girl in her class are constantly competing, and I think they're going to be doing that all the way up to their 20s, I'm sure. And then moved to UK, and you started working at Manchester Student Union. And again, I've listened to ways you talked about this, and one thing that struck me, and maybe I heard it wrong, but you talk about getting into the industry by accident, but actually you talked about, this is the role that I want, and I've found everything that I needed to do to go and get it. So I wonder if it was an accident, or actually you knew what you wanted, and you went and got those roles.
Yeah, I think initially getting into the industry was definitely by accident, in the sense that the job that I referenced earlier, where the culture was quite poor, I was really interested in education always, because I trained as a teacher, even though I didn't necessarily always want to be a teacher. When I finished my degree, I had 3 options. One was to do a job in the local county council as an arts officer. One was to work for a store, kind of like Marks and Spencer, working in visual display, which spoiler alert, was what I really wanted to do. I wanted to be the person doing visual display in big windows like Harrods, and I secretly still want to do that. Or was to train to be a teacher. And I said to myself, whatever I get, I'll do. And I got into the teaching course. Very cockily, I just got in, because actually I met people in that course who said, this is my 4th time trying to get in. And I was like, oh, I got in on the first go. I didn't realize it was as hard as it was. And maybe in hindsight, it was good that I didn't know how hard it was, because I would have had more pressure on myself. So when I finished university and spent a number of years in Limerick, in Ireland, which is in the Midwest of Ireland, if you're not familiar with it. I loved working with students. I loved being a student, and I ended up working in the University of Limerick initially. And my husband was saying to me, "Don't take that job. It's going to be a very hard job. It's not going to be fun at all, or what you think it is." And he was right to an extent. There are elements that were very difficult, like antisocial behaviour. But the residence life element was what I loved the most, because it tapped into that creativity for me, and it tapped into student welfare and really making sure students had the best experience possible. And the residents that I look after had a lot of international students who were just in love with Ireland and who were coming to Ireland because they might have had some connection via their ancestry, who would get excited at seeing a castle, because we had like old ruins in the background of our village. And every year they'd be like, "What's the name of that castle?" I'm like, "I literally have no idea." Like, to us, it was just our everyday landscape. So when I moved to the UK, my husband had said to me, "I have been offered a place on the NHS grad scheme again, a very prestigious scheme." And he had to pick three cities. One was London, Birmingham, or Manchester. And his best mate was a lecturer in Manchester, and he got offered Manchester. And he said, "Will you come?" And I said, I did a quick Google. I was like, 100,000 students, I'll get a job, I'll be fine. But what I had to do in the UK, and again, this kind of connects back to it being a hard time. I pretty much started my career from scratch when I moved to the UK 11 years ago. I took a huge pay cut, a huge level of responsibility cut in roles and duties. We had very little money. My salary was incredibly low at the time. I can remember friends coming over from Ireland who wanted to visit, and I had enough money to go for like one fancy cocktail in a bar somewhere. And my husband was giving me his bank card, going like, buy some more stuff or whatever, but have a good night out, because I was finding a very difficult transition over, even though Ireland's only a 40-minute flight away. There are actually differences in terms of how people behave in the workplace. And it was very, very difficult for me. The first 12, 18 months were very hard. And there was numerous occasions where I wanted to fly back home, and I was going to go back to my old job because there was an offer there to do that. And my husband was doing everything possible to make me stay. But I fought through it. I just kept going. And what you're referencing in your question is around wanting to work in residence life. And I just wanted to be a res life manager. I just thought that's the role for me. I would be awesome at it. I would be excited. I would run into work every day. And I would just Google the job every 2 weeks, res life manager jobs in the UK, because I could see the sector changing. I could see the roles are popping up. I saw one pop up in Lincoln, and I was like, "How far is that from Manchester?" And I'm like, "Oh, that's really far. That's not commutable." I'd see them pop up like in Scotland and London, and then one day one popped up in Manchester with Campus Living Villages. And I'd always really wanted to work for Campus Living Villages because I became aware of them when I became aware of Res Life. And I couldn't believe their headquarters were in Manchester, and I didn't know about this. I felt like, who am I to go work for them? I don't even know their headquarters are in Manchester. Like, I don't deserve that job. And I said to my husband, "That is my job." And he's like, "You better go get it." And I got the role, and everything really took off from there, from that moment. And they gave me some amazing opportunities, which really helped kind of my career develop to what it is today.
I guess I'm probably jumping ahead, and I'm always guilty of this, but talking about res life, particularly in its infancy, in a private provider, is very different from, well, I imagine I should probably ask you the question rather than telling you, but is very different from that res life in a university, right?
Completely different.
And I guess you probably had to tell people what res life was.
Yeah, I think
maybe even in the universities, I don't know, but certainly in private provider.
There are still universities today, and quite big ones, who don't have residence life models or have a version of it, but it's not what it is today or what's evolved to or what we think it needs to be for the students that are coming into our universities or into private buildings or wherever they may live. And what's quite lovely is that lots of people who are now starting to develop programs or are getting approval for programs will contact me and say, "How best do I start this?" And other people in the sector. I'm not unique in that at all. And there are some quite large universities that you would think they have that model in place and they have it down, that don't have it yet and are in the very early stages of trying to figure that out. When I worked in CLV, I loved my time there, but it was very much focused on the events and the activity. I remember saying to my boss, "We need to do more around the welfare of students. I want to get involved in the disciplinary and the conduct side of things. How can we support our university partners to make sure we're joined up in that space?" And he listened, and he wanted to get me more involved in that. But actually, I think I left maybe within that year, so it never got to where I wanted to be. But I had always a need to return back to universities because that's where I started. And I love being part of a university, being part of something bigger. and connecting with other people in other departments across the wider university as well, and learning from them and supporting their objectives as well, which is really, really important. And I think for me, true residence life sits within a university because you have those kind of like 3 pillars, as I call it, where it's the community side of things, the fun stuff, but also the welfare and the conduct elements as well. And developing a team around that and expanding a team. By comparison, our team at the University of Leeds is much smaller if you look at like Sheffield or Edinburgh or even Manchester and Nottingham. So I've got great aspirations to expand upon that. And one day, and we are getting there slowly but surely, we're like, you sneak in one more role here, one more role there. We're getting there, but it needs to be much bigger because we support effectively up to 8,500 students any given year. So to get the same equitable experience support across all residents, whether it's a private partner or our own, we need to expand that team so that we can expand the resource and deliver what we want to deliver. But it is very different in compared to the two. And even if you look at the private sector now, you'll have big operators like Unite Students who will take very seriously the welfare and have student support positions and have a myriad of things across their portfolio. Then if you look at an operator that's maybe half the size or smaller again, it will look very different. So it's not consistent even in the private sector, never mind within universities. But is it in a better place generally than it was 10 years ago? Absolutely.
So I want to dive into res life a little bit and those 3 pillars you talk about. First one is around fun stuff, events, activities, clubs, societies, and everything like that. I think I was listening to Sarah Canning's podcast. I don't know if it was Sarah that said it, so forgive me, Sarah, if you listen. But talking about the squeeze on cost of living for students, and they're generally all working as well as studying, and yet maybe it's tinged by my own experience where I didn't get involved in many clubs and societies and that sort of stuff when I was at university. Probably wish that I had have done now. But now, if the students are unable to afford to get involved in those events, activities, clubs and everything else, how can we still provide, the sector provides that experience and get them to get involved when they're clearly time poor and don't have a lot of, if any, disposable income?
Yeah. And it's interesting that you say you'd get involved in clubs and societies because this is where we have something in common, because either did I, because they weren't available. I went to university on a campus that was separate to the main university campus. All the art students are put into one place. They must have thought, they're weird, we'll send them over there to do creative things and, colour inside the lines, because that's what everyone thought we did. And we didn't have clubs and societies. And I remember there being a campaign to start them up, and I put my name down to join some, and then they just never happened. And I actually really needed it because I was quite lonely in my first year of university. Didn't get out with my flatmates. They weren't the people I thought I was going to meet at university. I thought all art students were the same and I would meet my people, and that didn't happen. But to answer your question about getting students more involved, I think actually there's probably even a bigger issue about working to get them to get the confidence to get involved, because we can put all the things on in the world that don't cost huge amounts of money and they can be quite small, but actually sometimes for some students it's just the confidence to leave the room and go try something new on their own because they haven't met somebody yet in their course or somebody who they have something in common with. And that's actually quite an issue in itself, where people just don't feel I can do that, because that is riddled with anxiety, or it's quite a scary thing. And it is a scary thing. For years, I never went to a public adult yoga class because I was like, I am not bendy like all those people and I can't do it and people will make fun of me. I have gone to it since I could overcome my fear and it wasn't that scary. But sometimes I think we can be very prone to saying, oh, but it's no big deal. But it is a big deal, because even we, at the age that we are things that we are fearful of doing because we might be ridiculed or we mightn't be very good at it. So we have to find ways to gently encourage people. And I think we do that through our resident life assistants and our full-time residence life team, but also keeping our accommodation teams who work within the residences fully aware of what residence life is doing. It's very easy to work in silo, that you can have them as people who are operational and they just make sure the building is safe and clean and they respond to things like that. And then Res Life do their thing. But actually the two need to come together. And at Leeds, we've been doing a lot of shadowing. Actually, we've had teams come in from the residences and shadow our accommodation team to understand how accommodation works around allocations and applications, but also shadow residence life to learn a bit more that it's actually not just unicorns and sunshine and rainbows, but actually there's other difficult things that happen and difficult cases that we are exposed to and our team is exposed to, and we have to find ways to overcome that. So they need to work together in harmony. Each need to understand what both the student and understand the benefit of it as well. I think some people don't necessarily see the benefit because sometimes a lot of res life activity happens in the evening hours or on the weekends when they're not working. So they don't see the joy they can bring for those who participate, and then can't talk about that to other students who they've recognised in the residents who might need something like that to kind of make home feel more home-like them, or make university feel like a place that is for them, or that makes them feel welcome, that they can adapt to. So for me, it's very people-driven. It's always been very, very people-driven, and sharing information and sharing best practice and teaching our teams about what great programs look like and what a great Res Life model is.
I was down at the CUBO site in Norwich here, spent some time with the team, and they said they're really struggling at the moment with the COVID generation, right? So the students that were 16, 17, 18 during lockdowns and that whole period, that they're coming to university and doing all the things that, you know, really struggling to socialize, get out of their rooms and everything else. And okay, we're not in lockdowns anymore. So that group of young people, are you seeing that across University of Leeds as well? Or?
Yeah, I think it's very easy for many students just to stay in their rooms and live an isolated life and not interact with people. And what's interesting about somewhere like Leeds is, one, it's so vast. It's a monster of a university, and we have thousands upon thousands upon thousands of students. And sometimes I think you can do things better when you work in a smaller university, even if that's like a lower ranked university with less funding. I sometimes really believe you can get things done better because there are less challenges and political red tape and people to get approval from to get stuff done that is for the betterment of students and student experience. So it is a beast of a university, and it's definitely probably taken me the bones of 2 years to get my head around it all sometimes. But yeah, we are seeing that. We are seeing students who are isolated, who are nervous, who have levels of anxiety when students are applying for accommodation now and they are listing any accessible requirement needs. The number of students who are saying that they are neurodivergent, who have social anxiety disorders. I've had students talk to me about it on open days, who are so nervous about coming to the open day and actually openly talking about having social anxiety and what that means for them and what they can and can't do and what restrictions are in their life and what they need to have the best experience at university. It's quite sad, actually. And again, like I said, we see it with a lack of people wanting to participate in activity, thinking it's not for them, being scared to do it, worried about what other people will think about them. And for those who are brave enough, who have the coaching and support to overcome it one baby step at a time, the results are phenomenal, absolutely fantastic. But it's a slow process to get many of those students out of that and into that space and to go through that kind of transformation that university should bring for you. And it's brilliant when it happens. But what the hardest thing I always find difficult to deal with is that towards the end of the year or close to the end of the year where someone says, I didn't like living where I lived, or I didn't enjoy my university experience because of these like 3 things. And we know there were 3 things that we could have fixed if they were brave enough to approach somebody. And then I go back to, well, do they know about how to reach out? Did we advertise our services well? Are we telling them about them in the right way? Is there something that we could do better from this that it results in one less student feeling that way and one less student withdrawing from university, withdrawing from their course, or choosing to live elsewhere? And that's really hard. I think it's going to take us many years to come out of that. And I'm not sure I have all the answers of how we do that, but it is something we are worrying about. I was only talking about it yesterday with one of the assistant heads of student support over on the other side of the university about this social anxiety and students saying, my anxiety, or my anxiety is bad today, as opposed to saying, I have anxiety. Like, you are not your anxiety. And sometimes anxiety or nervousness is actually quite normal in many situations, like before an exam or before an interview. Heaven knows I've had a bunch of that in my life. But it's how to develop coping strategies with that and normalize it and go, actually, that's quite normal part of the human experience, never mind the student experience.
So moving on to another part of res life, sort of welfare, pastoral care. Some tough topics to talk about, but I think I'm going to pick your brains on some of them, because you see it. That loneliness linking into what we just talked about. It How do we measure the impact that an increase in people feeling lonely? I mean, everything I read and listen to is saying that loneliness is incredibly detrimental to not only your academic experience but also your general health. But you have thousands of students to look after. You can't see every student every day and can't force people to come out. No matter the diversity of events or activities or support that you put in place. I'm not asking you for all the answers today because I feel like
I
I
know, I'm
just put
sitting
you
here going, I was like, how am
massively
I
on
going
the
to answer
spot there.
this?
Put you massively on the spot there. But how can we get in touch? And I'll give a personal example. So when I was managing a student accommodation site, I was always talking to the team about trying to put on for the events for the students that we don't see, because we saw the same students come to the same events because we put on the same stuff, free food, free drinks, like your podcast. But I could never manage it. No matter what I did, spoke to as many students as possible, everything else, I could still see those students, and they do the same thing that you were just talking about. Come to the end of the year and go, didn't really enjoy living here, didn't really interact with people, didn't like my flatmates. How do we reach, or how could we possibly reach those people?
I think like one of the obvious thing is the diversity of things that you're making available for students, that you don't put on activities that you would like as a student or that you would like as an adult. You've got to include the student voice in what you do. And if you've an opportunity to engage with your students' union and the many, many club societies that your university might have, do that, because students will go where other students are and they're more likely to listen to other students and go to things that they are shouting about than we might be shouting about. And we do a lot of that. And we've looked at what we do, the breadth and depth of it, and we've put on things that are like more quiet activities. It's not the large scale stuff. Sometimes it's coming into a room with 10 people, and 10 people as a percentage of the number of students with us is tiny, but that's fine, because actually, if it's 10 people that weren't going to engage that day or do anything, then it's 10 people who are happy. And they're doing puzzles and they're doing games and they're doing crafts. And sometimes they're the most popular stuff that's sell out. I can remember last year the team having to do 3 emergency runs to a shop for biscuit decorating supplies because they kept running out because the numbers were absolutely through the roof. And sometimes you can put on activities and you think, this is going to be amazing, and then no one comes, and then you put on something and it's like an absolute sellout, and there's a waiting list for it, and it never ceases to surprise me how that happens. And I'm very guilty of seeing random trends on TikToks and sending them to my team and going, what if we gave this a go? And I never expect them to do it, but 9 times out of 10, they'll do it. They probably roll their eyes and do it. And if it's success, I'm always like, I'm always kind of like smug about it. I'm like, I thought of that. I'm great. I'm so down with the kids. But yeah, I think the breadth and depth and including the student voice in that, you've got to have people who are passionate about the area, and you've got to teach people what great looks like. When I worked in CLV and I was creating our Village Life program that we then rolled out nationally, I was like, right, it's done now. It's going to be great. People have a budget. It's going to be fantastic. Then photographs started coming through of what people were putting on and how they were setting things up. And I was like, right. And they wonder why no one's coming. We've got a problem here. So actually we had guidance around how to run an event, how to set it up, how to make it enticing, how to make sure it's branded really, really well. So that, because I said, would you go to that event? They're like, no. I said, so how do you expect anybody else to go to it? In a much nicer way than that. And I think that it goes out to support as well, making sure that we have support available, that students see themselves in that. So there's been lots of conversations around, counselling teams, and there are no counsellors who are of colour or who are Black, and so by default would not understand the Black student experience. And so students who are feeling isolated and who see that there's a lack of an intersectional approach to support services will go, well, you're not going to understand what it feels to be Black in a very, very wide space. And that makes me really, really sad. So how do we change that? And we've done some work in that space. Our warden team is more diverse than it's ever been. Interestingly, our Res Life Assistant team, so our student team, is predominantly students of colour, and Leeds is not a university that is predominantly students of colour. But for some reason, they are attracted to those positions and work in those positions. And that's a bit of work that we're trying to understand. Why is that? But that's really good because it means actually there are students who can see themselves in them. And that's really important as well. And well-trained staff and knowledgeable staff. I think sometimes when there is research in the sector and things that are happening in our space, we can keep it to ourselves. We can discuss it at quite a senior management level. But I'm a big advocate for sharing that with those right across the services I have responsibility for and teaching them about what's important in the sector right now, what new report has come out, how that impacts that marginalised group of students. So, for example, CUBO did a report recently and research with Global Student Living, which is around vulnerable student groups. I shared that with our accommodation team. I shared that with our residence life team. We have hired a student intern to do research that looks at the student journey if you're a student who requires accessible adjustments. And I shared that research with her so that actually she understands the kind of wider research context as well. And people start to realise why we do, and why we need to change our wording, our thinking, our approach, our language, and that it does matter. It really, really does matter quite a bit.
I think, well, there's so much I can unpack. The first thing that came to mind is definitely relate to being, a 40-year-old white male. Do I know what events and activities and things people want to get involved in?
We just want to go to bed early. That's what we want to
exactly. I can go on TikTok, but who knows what the algorithm would show me rather than saying, yeah, great to get the teams involved. But yeah, I always struggled with that. Like, mega enthusiastic, trying to get people to this event, and nobody showed up, and so it's because I probably put on the event that I thought they wanted rather than or activity rather than actually what they did want. So coming on to, you talked about CUBO. So most people, I imagine, listening to the podcast would know what CUBO is and what it does. But for those that don't, why don't you tell us?
Well, CUBO is the College, University and Business Officers organisation, and it is a space, like many organisations who work in certain sectors, for professionals to come together who work in student accommodation, commercial services, catering, sport. And it's an organisation which supports those professionals. So they have an annual conference every year. The most recent one was in Belfast, hosted by Queen's University, which I was lucky to go to. So lovely to go home to Ireland. I didn't tell my mother I was home in the country, and I only live an hour south of Belfast. So she probably won't be listening to this, but if she is, I'm sorry. I had a lot of people who were absolutely appalled at the fact that I'd not told my family I was in the country, because I am very bad at going home. I think it's been 2 years since I've gone back to Ireland. I'm so bad. People come to visit me as opposed to me going to them. And CUBO put on a fantastic conference, and they have a winter conference, and obviously they do research like I referenced as well. And what I love about organisations like that is the opportunity to meet people who are doing a role like you, or a role that you might want to do one day, like a director position, for example, or people who are working in similar areas in higher education or different areas, but actually they complement each other really, really well. And I always say higher education, and particularly in the area that I work in, it's a very welcoming place. People don't bite. They're very friendly. They're open to sharing knowledge and ideas and best practice in what they're doing. It's competitive, but it isn't competitive. When I was in the private sector, people were very cards close to their chest. The big question was always, how much do you spend per head on residence life? And I was under such a strict rule never to talk about it, but I did, because I just thought, we're all trying to help each other really in the sector and help students. So I did actually talk about it. Not a lot, but I did. And that's what I love about it. And there are so many times where I can send a WhatsApp to somebody and say, I'm dealing with this right now in my job. Are you seeing this in your university in London? And somebody will reply. Or I can pick up the phone and have a phone call, or I can have a quick Teams call, or I can send an email and somebody will reply, or I can target somebody individual and go, you're experiencing this, you're great at that. How can I do better? And that's what I love about it, that professional network. That people are so open to helping other people, and it's very genuine, which is, it's nice. I don't see it's a space where people are out to get each other. It's actually very genuine and authentic. And when I go to those conferences, I always leave like, my cuppeth just runneth over when I depart. And that's how it felt in Queen's. Queen's were an amazing university to visit. I'd never actually been there before, which is shocking considering I only live an hour away. And it was such a welcome experience. And when you go to places like this and you're involved in organizations like this, it reminds you why we do what we do, which is to support students, to help them get the best experience ever and become the best versions of themselves.
Okay, and talk to me about your current role. We've talked a lot about around what you do, but it sounds like an incredibly broad role that you do at University of Leeds.
It is, yeah. I'm very tired, but in a good way. I started there as assistant director for residence life in the accommodation office in November 2020. So in the middle of COVID, which lots of people found a complete novelty, but actually I was really happy to join the middle of COVID. And at that time, because it was in accommodation, everybody working in accommodation was in the university. Loads of us were not working from home. We were very much in the university on the campus, which was complete tumbleweed. Which, as someone who was craving to go back into university, it was very weird. It probably took about 2 years for me to feel part of a university as students started to trickle back. It was so empty for the first year, which was quite sad. And people used to talk about the graduation experience and how busy it was between classes. And I just didn't have that for about 18 months. So looking after residence life in the accommodation office. And then last October, our director, who'd been with the university for 20 years, decided he was moving on to pastures new. And myself and Sue, who's the interim director, were asked to step up for a year, and we agreed to do that. So I took on then, I guess, operations of our residences, as well as putting res life and to accommodation, not to one side, still had responsibility for it. But those teams, they're very, very strong teams. So I could kind of put them to one side and go, listen, I'm still your boss and you're doing awesome. And of course we'll have one-to-ones, but I'm just going to concentrate on this a little bit. So it's been quite a whirlwind, because although I've got operation experience to where I started my career, there's a gap in the middle of my career where I've not been stuck in operations or doing a lot of it. So I'm back in a world of fire safety and fire stopping works. It is thrilling. I live for it. It's very exciting. Very exciting, but it's very important more than anything else. It's important to keep our buildings safe and compliant for all who live in them and for all who work in them. But yeah, that's a lot of my world at the moment. And refurbishment works, which is great. It's always great to do some really great projects like that. Lots of things around people. We always have a lot of people things that are like around recruitment. But it's been really lovely to go back to the floor. I'm a big advocate for going back to the floor and understanding the challenges and complexities that our teams have, that we think we know everything when you're in a nice little office somewhere nestled away in a university. But actually, when you go back to the floor, you see so much, you learn so much, you get to know your teams on a much different level. And I have been guilty of going to large scale events within organizations I've worked in. And I'm like, who's that person? How come I don't know them? I've never met them before. I can't remember their name, which is terrible. You should know who your team is. And that's allowed me to do that. It's been really, really lovely, actually, and get to know our teams a lot better.
So you talk with such energy and passion about res life and all things students. Where does that come from? Why?
Sure. I'm naturally an enthusiastic person anyway. I'm naturally very extroverted. So there's a bit of that, definitely. Although fun fact, someone told me recently I was too enthusiastic, and I was like, what? So I've gone online today, and I've actually, this is no word of a lie, I've gone online today and I've ordered a mug called Little Miss Enthusiastic, and I'm going to drink from it every single day. So where does it come from? I do think part of it is nestled in the fact that I had a poor student experience. My first year was really rough. For someone who wanted to go study art and go to art college her entire life from the age of 6, to go there and then it not be the experience you thought it was going to be is very, very difficult. It's quite a wake-up call. And on reflection, at 18, I was quite a naive 18-year-old. I was a horrific cook. I lived off crisp sandwiches and Yorkie bars, and that is no word of a lie. I can remember one of my flatmates who was really good at cooking, and this will sound like such a simple meal because it was. She baked potatoes and like some sort of meat and like beans, and there was leftovers. And she said to me, "There's leftovers, do you want it?" And I was like, "Oh yeah, cool." Like actually really like, I don't really want them, but I so wanted them. And they were the nicest potatoes I've ever eaten in my life, which is an Irish woman, it's a crazy thing to say. But like it was probably the most nutritious meal I'd eaten in 6 months at university. So I was a very inexperienced, naive 18-year-old, and I was also very serious. So when we had our first day of university, I was so excited. This was my dream. I got into the college I wanted to go to. I was studying what I wanted to study. And when I went to art school, I wanted to do a course where you try everything in the first year and then specialize for 3, because degrees are 4 years in Ireland. So I got into this particular school down in Limerick because I didn't know what I wanted to specialize in. I thought I would specialize in graphic design. I was convinced of it. I ended up going to sculpture, which is like mad. So the first day I was up at the crack of dawn, like I was ready to go. I can remember walking and like overtaking another girl because I was so excited to get through the gates of this university. And all my flatmates were still in bed. They'd been drinking the night before. And I couldn't understand this. I was like, but it's our first day. Like we've wanted to go our entire lives. But they didn't. They had already decided in the year prior that they had wanted to study art, whereas I'd known from the age of 6. So like, for 12 years that's what I was going to do. So I was unbelievably excited and very, very serious about it all. Wasn't a party animal, didn't go quite a bit in first year. Us and our flatmates didn't get on. They smoked, they drank, they sat up late all night, they made a lot of noise. And when you are someone who doesn't fit into that crowd, and again, I think back to students who are feeling isolated and lonely, and you're on your own in a bedroom, and everybody around you in the house is having a good time and enjoying themselves, and you're not, that's really alienating. And I lived at that time 250 miles away from home. And we didn't have social media the way students have now. So I couldn't just jump online and talk to people. If I was texting friends, if I ran out of credit, I had no one to talk to. So it was really isolating because we didn't have Wi-Fi in our rooms. I sound completely ancient now. So I would say in many ways it might have felt even more lonely, although I know students are looking online and seeing people having a great time and compare themselves. So I think it comes from that. I think when I say I fell into student accommodation and fell into higher education, I was probably destined to probably always work in it because my own experience was so poor. Luckily, made friends in the first year, towards the end of the first year, and we lived together in second year, and second year was brilliant. Third year was pretty good. And my final year I loved as well. And I think I would like to look back and if I had my time again, not be as serious, not take myself so seriously. And I actually sometimes joke that I would have loved to study in the UK because the university experience here is so different. And to come to a big city, because there's such a breadth and depth of opportunity available to students who go to big cities. And I think sometimes I would have liked to have done that actually.
So maybe it was a good thing that you had a bad experience.
Yeah. There's a message in that somewhere. There's an inspirational quote somewhere that somebody needs to write.
I was going to say last year. I'll cut that bit. Not so long ago, you became quite famous on LinkedIn for...
Oh dear. I didn't know you were going to go here.
asking, I wasn't at the event, but asking around the makeup of the all-star panel at the Property Week conference. Now, everything we've talked about so far, albeit you describe yourself as an extrovert, that takes some bravery to make the point. For those of us that weren't there, talk about why you felt the need to say what you did and what you said.
So I'll caveat by saying that I was invited to go to Property Week. It's not the first time I've been invited to be part of a panel. And again, they're expensive tickets. And I'm always extremely grateful to get the opportunity to go because regardless of what the agenda is, I'll meet somebody, I'll learn something, and it will always add something for me to my own personal development. And I always look ahead at the agenda and go, what's the topics this year? What's the kind of like key theme? Who's speaking? Who have I not met who I've always wanted to meet? Because there are people, I've got like a list of people I'm like, I've never met that person. I want to meet them. Brian Welch, I've still not met him in person. I need to meet this guy. And I've tried to, but he's always talking to somebody. But that aside, I looked at the agenda and I saw at the very end was this panel and it was titled, as you just said, the All-Star PBSA panel. And listed were all the names of the people. And I said, are they all men? And there was one name I wasn't sure if that was a male name. And regardless, even if it was female, that's still like quite a poor representation. And I looked up the name and I went, oh my God, it's all men on the panel. And even the chair is a man. And then they were labeling it All-Star PBSA panel. And I thought, well, I'm definitely going to that session. And I put myself in the front row because I was so eager to see this session. And it was towards the end of the day, if not one of the last ones, actually. And what generally happens at some conferences, and definitely happens at that conference, that people will nip away. And if you go to the bar across the road, you will find a lot of people with Property Week lanyards in the bar. And I never do that. I don't think I have done that before, because I think it's very rude to conference organisers, as someone who's organised similar type conferences. And I just thought, I was already, when my back was up already, the lack of diversity of the panel, the lack of representation of women, of people of colour. And they were introduced basically as there is nothing that these people don't know. And I thought, this is absolute BS. I'm infuriated. And I didn't know it, but they proceeded to have a conversation and whatnot, and to talk about key topics. And then there was an opportunity for audience participation, whereby you could ask a question, you could type it in via an app, and it would appear on this huge screen behind them. And you can submit the question anonymously or not. And I just thought, what am I going to ask here? And if I do, is it career suicide? And do I do it anonymously? I said, no, actually, I'm going to call it out. And I'm going to put my name to it. I'm just going to do it. I'm going to show that a woman has asked this question, and then I'm in the room. And I can't remember the exact word, and I have to actually look up the LinkedIn post, because it was last December when it happened. And I said something like, as an all-male white panel, what do we need to do to ensure, I think it's something to do around better representation of diverse communities, or paving the way for women to progress into senior positions, because they were all labeled, most of them were CEOs, or quite senior to the CEOs. And I didn't know if they would show it, because there was this nervous point of where it says the moderator's reviewing your question, so they're going to approve it. And I thought, they're not going to approve this because it's a bit controversial. And next thing, it appears on screen, and I had this moment of, oh shit. You can bleep that out if you want to. And when you see your name on this big, like, cinema-sized screen, and the chair said, I absolutely love this question, because here we are, like, what was his phrase? Something like straight out of a Monty Python film. He said something along those lines. I absolutely love this question. And two of the panel members attempted to answer it, and did quite well, in fairness. And another podcast covered this and said that all the panel members answered it. That's incorrect. Only two answered it. And those two individuals then messaged me afterwards on LinkedIn to thank me for the question. And one said, why don't you come down to London and meet the senior women in our team? And I was like, that's a lovely opportunity. Thank you very much. But afterwards, I was like, why aren't you bringing those women to the conference? And why should I make the journey to travel down to you? Like, again, another white male privilege. So that happened. And I had a lot of people come up to me at the conference and say, thank you for asking that question. That was a great question, men and women. And I was quite nervous doing it. So I'm on the train on the way home, back up to Manchester from London. And I thought, do I call this out online in a public manner? And I don't want to be someone that's putting stuff on LinkedIn or any platform just for the likes. But actually, I do see privilege as a position that I have, and challenging the sector to do better and be better. We all have an opportunity to do that. And I have a lot of privilege as a heterosexual, white, cisgendered woman born in this part of the world. I recognise that. Yes, there are times in my life where I might have been disadvantaged, but they're minimal compared to the experiences of many, many other people. So I think I've got an opportunity to use my platform in a positive way to call things out, so that we can do better, and to help people recognise that actually what you did there was really wrong, and this is why. But here's 5 ways in which you can make it better. So I opened the Notes app on my phone, and I drafted out what would be a post, because I thought, if I'm going to do this, it's got to be first thing tomorrow morning, so I have to be ready to go. And I wrote it up, and I phrased it and rephrased it, and I was getting some texts from people saying that was a really great question, thanks for calling that out. And then people were saying, I heard you did this. It was quite weird. So I wrote it up, and got it quite to how I wanted it to be. And I took a photograph of the panel as well. Didn't ask their permission, bit naughty, but I took a photograph of the panel to show actually what it was. And I put it into LinkedIn, and I just sat there. And I have this with every single thing I put in LinkedIn. There's always a sense of like nervousness around it, but I decide to feel the fear and do it anyway. And you know, what is the end game here, Rebecca? What are you trying to achieve from this? Because those conferences are intimidating spaces, Gareth, for so many people, not just women. And I have been to that conference and other ones where I've had men speak to me in quite a derogatory way and assume that I have been, and I quote, have you been let out for the day? That has been said to me in these spaces and places, and not recognizing that I have value and many people have value and have something to bring. So it just went a bit crazy. But what people don't know is the amount of messages I got privately of people sharing their own experience. There were also people who'd worked for the organizations who were associated with the panels who said, I'm so happy you called that out. I just can't say it publicly for various reasons. There was people contacting me saying, let's start a podcast together. And I was like, as someone who's done a podcast, it's a lot of work and I have no time for anything in my life right now, never mind a podcast. The Property Week did contact me, in fairness to them, very, very quickly. And we had a chat with them and conversations around how they can do better next time. And I've been helping them a bit with that. But I got other people involved in that. So Sam Kingsley, who you have interviewed, who's absolutely a wonderful, wonderful person who is so inspiring and I've learned so much from and continue to do so to this day. She's now heavily involved next year, which I'm thrilled about. And James Greenwood as well, who again brought a different element to it and taught me things about what is inclusive and not as inclusive that I didn't actually realise myself. So we had a really interesting conversation around it. And it is the highest performing post that I've had on LinkedIn. Try not to get too sucked into the analytics. Sometimes I'll do a bit of banter with people in my team around the analytics in LinkedIn. And I guess I'm proud of it, but there was a moment of, is this career suicide? Are people going to roll their eyes? This could go either way. It absolutely could go either way. And then I followed it up with an article, I think it was 12 things to make conference spaces more inclusive. And that produced quite a bit of trolling, I have to say, which I just looked at and thought, I'm not replying to any of that. They can just fight amongst themselves in the comments, and they did. And it was around trans inclusive spaces and gender neutral bathrooms. People really got kicked off over that. So yeah, I'm very passionate about equity. And I'm very passionate, and again, this ties back to my very first job out of university, about supporting young women in work, because we have a tendency to alter who we are to fit into spaces. And going back to the comment where somebody said that I was a little bit too enthusiastic, I actually challenged that back and said, I don't want to be a corporate robot. I am not a different person in work. Who I am is who I am in work, inside and outside of work. And I believe that you can hold any senior leadership role and be yourself, but you can measure it and you can adapt it for the space and situation that you are in. And there's been so many times I've been told to be less, to shrink myself, to stay in my lane, to not be as animated as I am. But the irony is the energy that I bring, or the animation that I have, actually has brought me more opportunities than not, and has attracted me to people who want to work with me or have asked me to work with them. And so in many ways, I think it's my superpower.
Well, I think the fact that you got so many messages, even if they were privately and people didn't feel comfortable as you did to speak about it publicly, shows that it needed saying and you were right to say it, and I think, but yeah, it's a very brave thing to do. And talking, you mentioned there, and talking that, well, there's a couple of things I want to talk to you about that you just referenced. One is, yes, I had Sam Kingsley on the podcast, and that was, one of the most incredible conversations I've had on here. Is, and both her and Jenny Shaw referenced you taking up the baton on the Living Black at university work, and again, that's where that passion for equity comes from. Again, I wouldn't say I've ever particularly been subject to a huge amount of discrimination. And you said yourself that, not so much as maybe other groups that we talked about, Black students at university, but, what about that work as, why did you want to take up that cause and run with it?
I guess, Jenny asked me, she wrote to me when they were setting up the commission, and she wrote to me, and I've told Jenny the story myself, that when the email came in, I literally looked behind me and I was like, does she mean somebody else? Like, sorry now. And one, because who am I to be on that amazing group of people? And I had a call with her and I was like, Jenny, I've not had these lived experiences. Yes, I want to advocate and be the best ally I can. And I'm learning all the time. I think me being passionate about equity and just EDI generally, it's been work. You have to do the work, in the sense that I have read about things, I've listened to things, I've met with people, I've learned to recognize the way in which my privilege serves me, but not other people. So it's been a slow kind of progression over the last maybe 5-8 years. It's not something I've been born with or just always was that way. And yeah, so she asked me, and I thought, well, that's an amazing opportunity. And I fundamentally believe that opportunities are everyday occurrences in disguise. And on this occasion, it was just an email asking me to be part of something. And you're not going to say no to something like that, because for your own professional development, it's going to be incredible. But actually, the fact that you can add to the sector. And again, I've had this conversation with Jenny. I hold her in such high esteem, and Sam as well. And jokingly, an old boss of mine used to call me Jenny Shaw, because I would come in with ideas and do things. And he'd be like, all right, calm down, Jenny Shaw. And I'm like, no, I don't want to be Jenny Shaw. Nobody else can be Jenny Shaw. But like, I just think we can do better as an organization, being inspired by what Jenny was doing at Unite. And it's been an amazing project to be part of. And now, actually mentioning CUBO again, they've taken over the helm of that project. So the work will continue. And we actually have a meeting next week, heading down to Birmingham to see some of the group again, which will be great. I haven't seen them in a long time. And when you were in that space, especially with somebody, you know, whose lived experience has been racism all of their lives, you can't not try and do something and make the space better for individuals like that, and for all individuals who are encounter that. Melissa Brown, who works at the University Account and is part of that commission, who's such a good friend and such a brilliant, brilliant person, she will say, I'm going to cry, you know, every meeting, and she'll cry and I'll cry and we'll all cry. Because when you hear the impact it's had on people and how it's held them back in their lives, or opportunities being held for them, or how they've been treated just because of the colour of their skin, or an accent, or where they're from, or something else, or people's biased opinions. I am in a place now in my life where if I hear content like that, or people making a joke or describing it as banter, I am happy to challenge that now. And I will challenge that, and I will respectfully do it, but I'll also say why it's not funny and why it's not appropriate. And I've done a lot of that in the last couple of years. Am I the best at it? No. But I just think every little bit is making a positive contribution in some way. And if that means that joke's not made again, or somebody thinks differently about their position and the power they have in the role or where they are in the world, then brilliant. But we're not perfect at it in our own institution. We're getting better. We've done lots of work. We've done our own kind of Live in Black research and made improvements in that space, which we're quite proud of. But we've got so much more to do. I was talking to somebody recently, they're like, oh, you're doing loads. And I was like, it's not enough. It's never enough. You know, it's capacity, or it's time, or it's something else. And I get attracted by shiny things all the time. So I have to kind of stop and go, no, let's just finish this project and then we'll do that project, you know?
You referenced trolling, or I hate to call it discussion, because it's often not a discussion, around trans students and that whole subject area. And one thing, Sam Kingsley taught me was, sometimes just Google it yourself, but other times it's okay to ask the question. So I'll ask the question, is where are we in that whole debate around, it seems so polarized, and all we want is for trans students to be safe on campus. Yes, we can talk about the wider world, but actually we're talking about higher education. What is being discussed in terms of trying to make campuses, well, even make them safer spaces, but also to try and stop the rage that happens in the debate? I mean, I guess my question is, what are discussions being had at the moment, in terms of that whole area?
I mean, if I'm really honest, discussions right now are probably very much centered around Israeli Gaza protests and discussions around trans safety. Not that it isn't important, it hasn't been important, is probably, I'm not part of any steering groups right now that's talking about that, put it that way,
Sure.
Because actually we're talking about protests on campus and if they will return on campus and how that might impact the welcome experience or graduation experience, things like that. And that is a focus for so many universities right now. And other universities have had more difficult challenges than we have had. So I think, going back to your question though, it's always the forefront of our mind within accommodation, because actually it does impact accommodation in very different ways. And our approach has been that if a student has openly identified themselves as trans and are engaging in conversations with us about where they live or where they want to live, then we will have a conversation about, what do you want? Who do you want to live with? Because actually not all of our accommodation is en suite. And I know it comes back down to the bathroom thing again, which is ridiculous,
It's
absolutely
crazy.
ridiculous.
Yeah.
It is, but it can be a factor for so many different reasons, for so many students, for like religious reasons, for example. So we say to them, what do you want? Who do you want to live with? What would make your experience the best it can be? And we do our best to meet all of that. And we make sure they're in touch with the right support teams in the university. But we did a lovely event that we brought in 2 years ago, and it was an LGBTQI plus meetup within residence life. And it was ridiculously popular. And we had a student who came to the event, was very scared to come to the event, wasn't sure if it was for them, because I think they were out in university but not at home. So again, very brave for them. And they came, thought it was a bit much and left, but then decided, something in them said, go back, go back, go back. And they did. And as I understand, that was a trans student, and they met other students and then left with a group of people. And our team always talk about that as that being the end game for support. So that's one way in terms of providing those spaces that then become safer spaces for students. So I think there's so much more we need to do. But for me, it comes back to like educating people about it, because we can put these measures in place, but really what I wanted to try and achieve is to change people's thinking around it. Around any communities, for me, it's just acceptance, and really it's none of our business to delve into it much deeper than that. It's just acceptance. It is what it is. People just want to be treated the way they want to be treated, given the name that they want to be given, and call that name. And it doesn't need to be any more complicated than that. It's like, how is this space safe for them? How does the space feel like home to them, or feel like a place they belong in the wider community? But I think actually, when we look at different groups of research that are forming now within the UK, so obviously we've done work around Black student experience with United Students, and now, Tim Daplin and his team have done work on vulnerable groups. Actually, I think there's now space to really look at supporting the trans community and research in that space, because we're starved of that in the UK, right? We don't have a load of academics working in student services and who are actually focused on that kind of research. It's very much happening in America and Australia, not so much here. So I think actually there's so much we need to do to understand, but we have to include and position the student voice at the heart of that, and involve our sabbatical officers and student unions. There's so much they can bring. We've got liberation officers in lots of our student unions now. There's so much they can bring and so much experience, and students are often speaking to them and not to us, and making sure that actually they are part of those conversations, that we can make the right decisions together, I guess.
Yeah, really complex issue.
It's really complex, and I think that's one of the challenges of working in higher education and working in a university, that when something's happening globally, it'll manifest some way within a university that are just like little microcosms of society. And sometimes we're working in fear of doing something or making a decision that might be so detrimentally wrong, it'll be on the front page of the Daily Mail, and no one ever wants that kind of attention, So, and that's not the right way to make decisions either, right?
No,
so that's one of the challenges and stresses I think that can become with working in a university for many people.
You have to be across so much, don't you?
Yeah,
there's
you really
so
do.
much to take into account. I asked you about those difficult topics there, so I'll try and ask you about the quick fire round questions next that might be a little bit lighter. So thank you for answering those questions. Quick fire round questions. If you could change one thing about the world, what would it be?
I had a good think about this, and I thought, do I put something like really kind of monumental, or do I have something quite trivial? I think, trivial. I'd love Ireland to win the Eurovision again. I'm a big Eurovision fan. We've won it 8 times. We're now on a par with Sweden. We need to win it. We need to relive the 90s again. What a time to be alive with the Eurovision. That's very silly, I know. But I think on a more serious note, and it goes back to the topics that we were talking about, is very much tied into, I'd love for people just to wake up and one day we all recognise the privilege that we have in our lives and how it's afforded us the lives that we have. And I had a very interesting conversation with quite a senior person in our university about 2 years ago now. And I explained to them about power and privilege. And again, I'm not an expert in this. I've read a bit, I know a bit, and I try and practice it. And I said to this person, you are a white male. You are in a very senior position in our university. You have power, privilege because of that. And they were like, well, whatever do you mean? And I explained it to them. And then I said, because of who you are and because I work with you, I have power by association. And they still didn't really get it. And I said, how many times in the times that we've worked together have you said to me, I always get what I want? And they kind of stopped. And I went, because you've got power and privilege, and your boss is also quite a powerful person in the university. So you have even more power by association. And that's just one element of the privilege that you have in your job, never mind your life. So I'd love people to kind of like, one day we all wake up and they go, I get it. I get it now, and the world would be a better place for it.
Okay. And what advice would you give someone who wants to change direction but doesn't know where to start?
I would always say, what brings you joy? What makes you happy? What are the things that you're able to do with ease that other people find hard or difficult to do? What do people ask you advice on? Who do they come to you about? And what are you passionate about? What sparks joy in your life? Which is very Marie Kondo, I know. But yeah, people bring me happiness. So I love leadership and leading people and being part of teams and seeing people go on to do great things. So when I think about what I want to do next, it's always very people focused. So what brings you joy?
That led me nicely into my final quick fire round question, which is, what is going to be your next big change?
Don't know, Gareth. I really don't know. Sometimes I debate about moving from Manchester to Leeds because that would make my life a whole lot easier in terms of commuting on the M62. I think I talked about this at the CUBO Res Life conference where I was asked to speak about career actually and getting your next career. And I'm a big believer in manifesting things. And one day, maybe not now, maybe not for 10 years, my big change would hopefully be to become a director of student experience. So I'm putting it out into the world.
We'll amplify that. That's for certain. And final question, the one that some people dread, is if you were to recommend a guest or more than one guest for me to speak to on the podcast, who would it be?
Well, I have a humongous list for you, Gareth. So
I don't mind. I don't mind a big list.
You might want to edit it out. So I've got a list of a lot of people. So I think, and they're all women with the exception of one man at the very end. I'll tell you why I've suggested one man, because they're not very well known in the UK. But I've suggested, you might want to edit this out at some stage. I have suggested Jem Turner, who is a disabled content creator. Kelly-Ola Cartwright, who's very involved in Living Black research and has worked with myself at the University of Leeds. Sunday Blake from Wonky. Melissa Brown, absolute star from the University of Kent. I'm suggesting you go further afield over to Australia and talk to Marion Gray at Deakin University.
Okay.
Kirsty Woodward, who is the University of Leicester, but also the chair of CUBO. Katie Lemon from the University of Liverpool, and Carol Thomas from UAL, who's the EDI lead for CUBO. Sarah Canning, who you mentioned, who is wonderful, and her partner in crime, Dini Lee. Amanda Castre, who's just left the University of Ulster but has gone to Tasmania because she's from that part of the world. Dominique Thompson, who's mental health advocate and does amazing work supporting universities. Vicky Ackerley from the University of Manchester. Harriet Noy, who is an amazing example of an entrepreneurial student who started a business in university and now has made that business come to life and has worked at lots of universities. Osara Otabo, who's very involved with Living Black, working as an EDI consultant. Gillian Almond from Royal Holloway University, who is just a formidable woman. And hopefully she won't mind me saying this, but I always found her a bit scary, but actually she's really, really lovely. And there's a couple of people who are probably not so well known, who don't put themselves out there, but who help the sector quite a bit. So Hilary Crook from Hatch Legal is the go-to legal person for all things in student accommodation, but she is one of the funniest people you would ever meet. So if you can get a hold of her, I'd highly recommend that. And Charlotte Webster in the University of Leeds does great work around report and support and deals with very difficult stuff. And Claire Slater, who is a consultant with Lyme, so is very passionate around supporting victims of domestic violence and sexual assault, which is ex-University of Bristol. And then the one man I'm going to mention is a man called John O'Rourke, who is the COO of Plassey Campus Centre in the University of Limerick, which runs all the accommodation and loads of services. But he is the first person who gave me a job in student accommodation. And I am still friends with him to this day, as I texted him yesterday. And he is absolutely brilliant, but is very shy about the limelight and needs to be out there, and has such a breadth and depth of experience, an award-winning experience, that I would love to hear him speak about his career journey because it's really fascinating and he's really brilliant at what he does, as are all of the people and all the brilliant women I've just mentioned. So that's quite the comprehensive list. I give it a lot of thought.
I can tell I've got about a year's worth of episodes to do
You're
now.
welcome. I will send you my invoice.
No, that's fantastic. Thanks for recommending those. One thing that came to mind when we're talking to sum up this conversation is in being too enthusiastic. I don't think you can be too enthusiastic, and but
Yeah,
if
who
that
knew?
but if that's what you are, then carry on being enthusiastic. I've learnt loads today. Again, thanks so much for answering questions about some tough subjects. But I love exploring the tougher subjects because, like you say, awareness and education or getting people to learn more is always great. So yeah, thanks very much. I really enjoyed it.
No problem. An absolute pleasure, Gareth. Thank you.